Thank you for coming. A couple schools and coaches canceled in the last day or today. But hopefully, I wanted to do this before the tournament on the 23rd and 24th, so people would be able to use perhaps some of the concepts and information. But it's also final exams for some schools, depending whether you're on a semester, a trimester, and people's final exam schedules vary because we have so many public, charter, and private schools on different schedules. So there's no way we can hit it for everybody. But now for a substantive introduction by Director of Forensics Kelly Young, a former student of his who's now risen to prominence in the coaching ranks of college debate.
Yeah, thanks for coming out. Our speaker today is Gabe Murillo. He was a two-time semifinalist at the National Debate Tournament in college and a semifinalist. He debated at a semifinalist at CETA, I guess, is what I meant to say. He was top speaker at the National Debate Tournament, which is an incredibly difficult feat, and just an all-around amazing debater. I think he's become an even better coach for the University of Oklahoma. And he debated at Holland, Michigan, so he's a local kid, and he loves Detroit, Michigan in many ways, and so that's about the only sort of substance I have to initially discuss, other than Gabe is really knowledgeable about a number of critical strategies that people deploy. Oklahoma has been on the forefront of a lot of critical arguments regarding race and a variety of other critical scholars. So we could not have any more appropriate of a speaker for the topic of discussion today. So two things to note, just sort of technical things, is that my camera is not working, so Gabe can't see you. So you can react however you want to his presentation. There's no pressure on you. But there's a microphone right here, which he can hear you, but if you have a question, speak up. And then if he can't hear you, walk up here and ask the question, and then he'll be glad to answer your question. But I turn it over to you, Gabe.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. Hi, Gabe. Okay, great. I can hear everybody. So the way that this is going to work, please feel free to stop and interrupt me at any point. I can't see anybody, so if you have any questions, I need you to get my attention. The suggestions that I have today aren't particularly complicated from a strategic point of view, but I hope to kind of explain some points of difference that you can create with affirmatives, especially Afro-pessimism affirmatives, that may not be obvious right away. So to begin, I'm going to talk about two types of affirmatives that deal with anti-blackness. The first is an Afro-pessimism affirmative. How many of you are familiar with Afro-pessimism as an argument?
I am.
Okay, good. So we've had some people reading Wilderson?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So the kind of core principle then, when it comes to creating a negative strategy against an author like Wilderson, is figuring out a point of disagreement. Now, a lot of the arguments that Wilderson makes are ones that are kind of difficult to disagree with, as well as a lot of other Afro-pessimists. The kind of pervasiveness of anti-blackness, the gratuitousness of violence against black folks, they're all things that you don't want to go into a debate and argue, because there's truth, almost capital T truth to those statements. So instead, it's important to find an area that you can disagree with, and I believe that area comes down to the question of ontology. Are people familiar with the concept of ontology?
I am. Yeah. I am too.
Okay, someone come up to the mic and explain to me what, if I were to say blackness is ontological, is there someone who can explain to me what it means?
Is it learning about what blackness is, or that's not?
Or if you just want to start with someone saying what ontology is, so start with that.
It's the state of being.
Okay, what is that? What package that a little bit?
So if you say blackness is ontological, it's not a physical state, it's the way that society has placed black people, based on the gratuitous violence that has happened to them. It's, almost difficult to explain. It's not a physical state of being, right?
Okay, good. It's not, yeah, it's not physical good. So ontology has to do with the way that our relationships structure the world, right? So that is what being is. Being is the relationship between us. So when we say blackness is ontological, you're right, we're saying it's not physical, it's not something that you can, simply grab onto because it exceeds that. Does that make sense? So what we're saying then is the Afro-pessimists say that anti-blackness and blackness is structural. It is ontological. It is something that kind of preconditions and predetermines relationships that exist between people. So that, I think, is a point where in literature we can kind of create a negative strategy. So the bigger strategy that we're taking Afro-pessimism at, which starts from the premise that blackness is ontological, predetermined, and structural, and question that. Question whether or not it is blackness that structures our relationship to all other things. So instead then, negative strategy, how many people are reading Middle Passage affirmatives on this topic?
Nobody here, but there's a team that runs it in the league.
Yes.
Okay, so let's start, so people are somewhat familiar with that argument. So the Middle Passage affirmative that talks about blackness is ontological would say that the Middle Passage is a foundational moment for anti-blackness, and it is through the Middle Passage that anti-blackness became ontological or conditioned our relationship with others. So that there are others like Gilroy, who wrote the book The Black Atlantic, that kind of make that argument, make that Afro-pessimist argument. Now, to counter that then, are people like Tinsley. Has anyone heard of Tinsley as an author?
Someone wanted to repeat the last thing you said.
What was the author's name, the first one?
Gilroy, Gilroy,
Thank you.
and the book is The Black Atlantic. So to counter that, Tinsley, who wrote the article Black Atlantic, Queer Imaginings of the Middle Passage, and I'll send Kelly all this information after this, so Charles not as important as I need this really. But Tinsley argues that blackness, especially in the Middle Passage, is not something that is ontological, but instead is contingent. In other words, it's not a predetermined structure, but instead be influenced by concepts of queerness or relationships or some sort of social life that exists. Even the slave ship is the argument that Tinsley makes, that there were romantic and non-romantic bonds that created that displays kind of possibility of social life even within social death. When I say social death, are people familiar with that concept?
Yes.
Okay, does someone want to explain that concept to me? No one?
It's the idea that black people don't have political power, they don't have ontology, so that they are socially dead within civil society.
Very good, yeah. So it is the idea that within this concept of civil society, that it is already marked that the black body is dead within the concept of civil society. So what people like Tinsley say then is that within that social death is not an absolutist concept, but instead it's something that can be negotiated through relationships. So that is how I think you can address things like Middle Passage affirmative to create kind of a strategic difference. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the points of difference there. So the first point of difference is that anti-blackness is not ontological. that instead it is contingent for its ability to change within relationships. Now, you can go beyond that then and say that accepting blackness as ontological replicates the very categories that anti-blackness authors are criticizing. Now, once you've established a reason why anti-black violence may be contingent as opposed to ontological, the second step to creating a negative strategy is to posit an alternate theory of, in this case, the middle passage. Is everyone following so far?
No.
No?
I hate to be the abstainer. So
No, please.
he's saying that it's not ontological, that it's from relationships, but there's an alternative view of the middle passage? Is that what you're
Yes.
saying? Okay.
Right, so the context of when you're creating negative strategy to an Afro-pessimism map, the two components then are, one, winning that anti-blackness is not ontological,
Okay.
and two, presenting an alternate theory to whatever the affirmative is about. In this case, we're talking about a middle passage. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, great. So, I'm sorry, was someone saying something?
You're hearing things.
So then, in this instance then, there are authors like Tinsley who posit another theory about the middle passage. And Tinsley is an author who would say that the middle passage is an example not of anything ontological, but instead the way that cross currents and intersectionality can have great influence on identity and can provide access to social. So now what we've done is constructed an argument which agrees that anti-blackness and anti-black violence are very serious problems, that agrees with the kind of impact level of the affirmative, but still is able to provide a different explanation for the world that allows you to have a debate as opposed to everyone disagreeing with each other. So, in that instance then, the argument you're making is that things are more complicated than one structural issue. And you provide historical examples that can counteract the Afro-pessimist view of social fact. Does that make sense?
What? Are you going to give us some?
Yes, I have in fact already listed one author, an article that is really just sent out to Kelly. Basically, what this author does is, in an academic sense, goes negative against Afro-pessimist affirmative. All right, and it makes the argument that the cross currents of the ocean and the experience of the slave ship was beyond simple ontology and was also experiential for folks on the slave ship.
Gabe, what alternative does Tinsley offer? Because my teams have hit Tinsley and I've only hit the queer Atlantic, where it's like instead of focusing on that, like Wilderson allows for violence to still happen to queer bodies, and they only take that particular route. Does Tinsley offer another alternative other than focusing on the queer body?
It's also important to understand that Tinsley talks more about just the queer body. Instead, the concept of cross currents is what Tinsley writes about. And what she's talking about there is basically an idea of intersectionality. Have people heard of intersectionality?
Yes.
Okay, great. So Tinsley is kind of a modified version of intersectionality that is more about queerness, but also about femininity, gender, nationality, ethnicity, etc., and how all of those things complicate a reductionist view of anything having to do with the ocean, the Middle Passage, or anti-blackness or law. So Tinsley's argument then could be reduced to simply saying, when you posit that the slave ship was an example of social death, i.e. anti-blackness in civil society, you bypass the kind of complications within civil society. You bypass that relationships are more than one unidirectional understanding of the world. And Tinsley says that that is necessary to a more inclusive and a more thorough understanding of how civil society functions. Does that make sense to people?
Yes.
Okay, so I think that the main, so that's kind of a specific example of just one affirmative, the Middle Passage Afro-pessimism Act. But I think the main thing to remember when you're constructing negative strategies is the real formula for it is to first find a strong theoretical point of difference, and second is to offer an alternative theoretical explanation for the arms area of the affirmative. So that allows you to agree with a majority of the affirmative while still producing a competitive strategy to debate about that has real meaningful difference. So if that's your formula then, let's kind of reverse the script. Is survival strategies a concept that, or argument that has been kind of going around?
Yes.
Okay, good. So let's flip this script then and talk about putting together a negative strategy for an app which talks about survival strategies. So survival strategies differ slightly from kind of a pure Afro-pessimism and pure in quotes, because survival strategies recognize the social life that can exist for people who live in conditions of social life. Right? So when someone says a survival strategy, they are demarcating ideas, whether it be through performance of the things that have been performed or certain strategies that allow people to have life even within the confines of social death. So following our formula of a major point of difference and alternative theory to describe the world, against survival strategies, what are some ideas that people might be able to come up with? And remember, we can use the theory of Afro-pessimism in this instance because survival strategies are distinct. So then, let me help along here. Imagine then that I'm going to tell you, you have to make the most Afro-pessimistic argument possible. What would a point of difference be then with somebody who says that survival strategies provide social life?
You have no social life. You don't fit in society.
Oh, I'm sorry, what was that?
The fact that you don't fit within society, you can't exist within the confines.
Okay, very good. So a point of difference then that we could make is to say social life is impossible, right? That until civil society and the construction of anti-violence is destroyed, there is no social life, right? There's only social death. But now we have flipped from our argument earlier, and we have made the argument, the Afro-pessimist argument, that instead of the survival strategies, which focus on contingent parts of social life that exists, we should focus purely on the ontological, non-physical, structural concept of anti-blackness. All right, so now we've created a point of difference, which says survival strategies believe that anti-blackness can be fought in some contingent manner, but in reality, those things are ultimately ontological. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, so, and what's the alternate theory then? Once we've said anti-blackness is ontological, that means that it can't be addressed in a contingent or physical way. It must be structural. What theory can we use to explain what the affirmative is talking about?
Could you repeat that?
Yep. So we've now done the first part of our kind of creating a strategy, which is you found a point of difference. And that point of difference is the ability to create social life within social net. So what theory have we used then to explain anti-blackness?
Afro-pessimism itself would be the alternative theory.
Very good, yes. So now we have used Afro-pessimism as a theory to explain the way that anti-blackness. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm not sure what caused the occasional feedback.
Just be it's pretty harsh on my side. Alright, so
I don't know what it is, Gabe, because nothing's moving or changing on our side.
I'm sorry, what was that?
I don't know what it is because nothing has been moved or nothing's making noise on our side. So I don't know why it's fine most of the time when that randomly happens. So go figure.
Okay, classic technology. Alright, so now,
Gabe,
yes.
I hate to backtrack, but I'm losing the whole concept of Afro-pessimism. Just the hopelessness, or how are you defining it?
Afro-pessimism is the idea that civil society is irredeemable.
Oh, there's no solution.
Because it is structured, Wilderson, and I forget which book it's in, but Wilderson has a passage where he says that, there are many passages in fact, where he says that civil society is both literally and metaphorically built on the death of black bodies. So from slavery, creating the conditions for the American economy, to gratuitous violence, creating social bonds within white America. There's Afro-pessimists, again, quote, pure Afro-pessimists would say that there is nothing redeemable about civil society. So any attempt to reform that relationship with society should be abandoned instead for kind of the earliest version that people read of anti-blackness is this idea of, burn it all down, or unflinching analysis of the structures of anti-blackness. So that is Afro-pessimism. It's the idea that civil society is irredeemable.
So
There is no good part of civil society. There is no part of civil society that can be saved.
So there's no solution at all to it, though? Just destroy it?
Yes, exactly. There's no solution to work within that ontological frame, so we have to destroy it.
Okay, how will we get around that when it comes to critical versus policy debate?
Well, critical versus policy debate, that's a great question. My cat's getting in my... Sorry, I'm going to go to jump in. All right, so the most important argument, this is why it's the best point of difference to kind of create, but the most important argument is winning that anti-blackness is not ontological. All right, in other words, it is not something that underlies the entire structure of our existence. Because once you've done that, then you can begin to advance an argument about reformism, all right, and how working through institutional structures or working through civil society can be productive. But again, either way, whether you want to go critical or policy, the most important point of contention is this question of whether or not Afro-pessimists are correct that anti-blackness is ontological.
And are there any authors that show that anti-blackness, anti-blackness is not ontological?
Yes, there are quite a few, especially within African studies, that talk about this. One of them is Peter Hudson, and this is another piece of evidence and citation that I'll be sending to Kelly in a packet that will hopefully help people out. But there's a lot of literature that discusses specifically Wilderson and concept of anti-blackness is ontological. But are people kind of understanding why that's such an important point of contention?
Yes, I think so.
Okay, great. So that is kind of, that one argument is definitely the most important thing to kind of think through when you're going for your strategies, because it first creates a point of difference between the arguments, but secondly, it's necessary to really win any impact. Because if Afro-pessimists are correct and anti-blackness is ontological, then it's difficult to win that anything other than the affirmative is a good idea. Now, which is also why, on the flip side, if somebody reads an argument about anti-blackness that's not Afro-pessimism, if you win that argument that anti-blackness is ontological, it's difficult for the affirmative to win their argument. And that, when I say things are simple, that as far as a framework for having these debates is really all that you need for kind of an intellectual framework. But where you go from there is where kind of creativity comes in. So what I like to do is to have people with questions about what we've talked about so far, kind of going through those arguments, maybe some ideas that people have, or questions about Afro-pessimism that it may help to understand before we kind of try to put together these negative strategies. So does anyone want to start with some questions or ideas?
I have a question, Gabe. What do you think is going to define who wins that argument? If you're attacking whether it's ontological or not, what do you think is going to sway a judge as to who's going to win that argument?
That's a great question. I think that there are a couple of things. The first is examples, and kind of that can go in both directions. So whether it's examples that prove kind of the irredeemability of civil society, or examples that prove social life within those confines. I think that, the evidence that everyone reads is pretty equal in quality, so it's not going to come down to, in a close debate, just whose evidence is correct, but instead it provides the most compelling examples of that. And I think that for people defending that Afro-pessimism or anti-blackness rather is ontological, the examples of gratuitous violence are the ones that really should be mentioned and explained in the context of ontology. Is everyone familiar with the concept charges of gratuitous violence. That's a term I've used a couple of times. And
Could you clarify it?
so gratuitous violence is violence that is in excess of civil society. So in other words, it's kind of these forms of violence that could only be done to bodies or people who are outside the confines of civil society. So an Afro-pessimist would say, for example, that lynching is an example of gratuitous violence. It is violence that has only been acceptable, against black folks. It's something that is used, even members of police forces use this gratuitous violence in order to enforce the law outside of the confines of the law. Police brutality, and specifically police murder, is an example of gratuitous violence. It's just something that is obviously unacceptable within the confines of civil society, but still exists and continues to black bodies, black folks, and people who are marked with blackness.
Okay, quick question. What is defined as blackness when you want to relate it to gratuitous violence? Is it black people in general, or is it anyone who isn't white and male?
That's a big question. There's definitely a debate to be had there as far as what is blackness. And that's something that I don't think is. That's something that I don't think is necessarily resolved in the literature. I think there are two viewpoints on it. One is that blackness is an exclusive category to exactly how you would think it. Blackness is the anti-identity. Blackness is the slave. Blackness is black. Blackness is, you are marked with blackness. So it's oftentimes something that exists and is coded within the visual register. And that's kind of, black folks that we're talking about, and people. They're also, even within that definition, there's some interesting kind of categories. If you look into India, where there are certainly groups who have been through slavery, who are darker than other Indians, and that kind of creates a consistency within the concept of blackness as within the visual field, as well as kind of the concept of the slave is blackness. Other people would go kind of beyond that and say that blackness is in relation to whiteness. So blackness is that which is not white. So there are varying degrees of blackness. So it could include what we would consider other races, whether it be Latino, Hispanic, Indigenous, etc. Those could also be considered under the umbrella of blackness because they have that relationship to whiteness. Now, if you're talking about a pure Afro-pessimist perspective, they would go with the former, the first definition, and say that blackness is a condition that was created in the Middle Passage. It was created when slavery came to America. So they would have a more limited definition. Someone like Tinsley, or someone who's more of an Afro-optimist, would probably have a broader definition of the concept of blackness, and that's how that debate goes down. But that's a great question.
So is the only way to beat Middle Passage pretty much to prove that, other than ontology, is there any other way to beat Middle Passage of Afro-pessimism?
There are ways that you could beat them, but not as strategically sound. You could read a capitalism critique, but then you would have to disagree with large parts of the affirmative. And you would have to, that makes certainly minimal, but the that I've prepared to talk about some of that is the ability to go negative against this style of affirmative without disagreeing with a lot of the kind of impact style stuff or the general thesis. So there are ways that you could read like a capitalism critique or a critique based in psychoanalysis, but those in a lot of ways create a lot of disagreement with the affirmative, and that is a more difficult kind of negative strategy to develop, but it's certainly possible. Other questions?
I kind of missed the whole section on intersectionality. Could you sum it up for me again?
Yeah, sure. Intersectionality is the idea that identity is not something that exists on a singular plane, but instead identity is at a cross point of multiple different identities. So, for instance, a black woman is not simply, or not simply, but it can be categorized as simply as black or woman, but instead it's at a unique intersection of black women, and that experience is one that is unlike. And while there are similarities, it could not be said to be the same as a black man or a white woman. But instead of that intersection of identities creates uniqueness in positioning as well as understanding of the self.
Okay. Does blackness fall under mass intersectionality in the case of anyone who isn't white is blackness, or is that different?
It depends on the theory. Again, this is kind of a theme, I think, in debate, and I know this for sure because I joke around when people read contradictory arguments. The concept of blackness is not one unidirectional thing. So, again, pure Afro-pessimists would say that blackness doesn't apply to intersectionality because blackness is not an identity. Blackness is in opposition to identities. It's a non-identity. All right, you can think of it from the lens of slavery, the way that identity and culture was taken away from the slave. Right? We're not taught to read, to write, or did not have that identity. And cultural expressions were suppressed for the slave. In that instance, or that, if you continue with that, then the blackness is not an identity category to Afro-pessimists. It is an ontological position. So whereas identities can change or have positive aspects to them, blackness is constant, consistent, and is always in opposition to civil society. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Other questions?
So you're giving us neg strategies against it, but it's run as a negative argument. Still the same strategies. You are affirmative, and you're putting a case forward as somebody runs the race came against Afro-pessimism. Your strategy is still the same?
Oh, well, one more. So, what I'm explaining, or was trying to explain, was what to do against these arguments if they were affirmative. If you are affirmative, you are right, but you can take a lot of these. So if you are affirmative, someone needs a middle passage critique against you, you can use a lot of these same concepts to answer. All right, but the difference that you would make there is you would say, because anti-blackness is not ontological, we are able to have progressive reforms within civil society. And that would be kind of the thesis of the affirmative answer. And the example of that progressive reform would, obviously be the affirmative. But again, whether you're affirmative or negative, I think the most crucial component to debates about anti-blackness is the question of ontology.
Sure.
Did I get your question right there? Sometimes I answer the wrong question.
That was great, thank you.
Okay. Anyone else questions about what we've got? Okay. Well, I know that there was also, there are questions about debating identity-based apps that talk about feminism.
Yes.
So that's kind of that section I was going to go over, and then, well, did I hear some food coming in a couple minutes?
Around 5:30, maybe.
Okay. So that's in like 10 minutes. All right, well, I think that I don't want to start next section and then kind of have to take a break. So can we take a break now and then come back after people have had a chance to get some food and talk about other apps?
So the food isn't here yet, so, you know, if there's perhaps an introduction to this area that you could do, and then if we need to take a break, you know.
Yeah, okay. Sure. Here's what I'll do. Why don't we have people, because the concept of feminism is even more broad than raising anti-blackness. So I have people who have heard the type of affirmatives that we're wondering about, kind of giving a rundown of what we're dealing with. What are we trying to insert as far as the apps talk about gender identity?
We've run into hydro-feminist cave, where water is considered, you know, a source of feminism, and so anything that harms water or intrudes water is somehow metaphorically invasive of women.
Okay?
We've run into the Sirens app. I think the Xylem put out, good old Edmund Zager. That's kind of like women. The ocean is a metaphor for women in the way that we've now made the ocean masculine is harmful. So like their app is reclaiming the feminine of the ocean. We've also run into the kind of like Vermont, the St. Paul Central, we're dancing to reclaim our bodies type apps. That's pretty much what I have.
Okay. Have there been others?
There are more traditional feminist critiques or asks like feminism related to international relations, that concepts like securitization are anti-feminist, concepts like hegemony are anti-feminist.
Okay.
Oh, there's Caribbean feminism too that we faced. I forgot the basics, but it's feminist. So, yeah.
Okay. Well, I guess a quick discussion we can have then before we get really into this is a discussion of the difference between sex and gender. And this is, if anyone's taken any coursework or anything in any feminist studies, this is what you always start with. So I think it's a good starting point for this discussion. So when I say there's a difference between sex and gender, does anyone want to tell me what I'm talking about?
Sex is what you legally are, and gender is what you emotionally identify as.
Okay. All right, I think that's a good start. Does anyone have anything they want to add to that?
Sex is biological, kind of like what he was saying. Gender is what you claim for your own body.
Good. I like that, what you claim. So that's great. So the difference then is sex is something that is biological, and it is what you're born. And that's kind of the marking that we give you when you're born based on biology. Gender is what people would call a performance. Okay, and what I mean by that is that gender can be performed in any way. So if I were to, shave my beard, put on a wig, and, make up and shave mustache as well, I could perform a feminine identity, even though I am biologically a man, and vice versa. So gender is something that happens on a spectrum. Okay, where sex is relatively stable and static, although obviously can be manipulated in some ways, gender has a whole spectrum of performance that can exist. Now, this kind of concept was really explained well by Judith Butler in her explanation of the way that drag queens or trans folks are able to perform gender outside of traditional concepts. And that is a really important difference because the conflation of these two things can be really problematic. And it seems like even within these affirmatives, that's something that can be used as a negative or strategic argument. Are there any questions about that, about the sex-gender division?
No. Is gender tied into intersectionality as well? Because I've heard about how people use middle passage in relation to the queer Atlantic I've heard about, also from Xylem. They talk about how men were forced to have sex with each other as a form of comfort. Is that tied into intersectionality as well, or not?
That's actually from the Tinsley article that we were describing before. But gender, I would say that gender nonconformity is definitely a question that falls on the scale of intersectionality. So if you were, born a man but performed your gender in a feminine way, then that would be a point on the kind of intersectional analysis. And that is also an interesting question to bring up with the Tinsley article, because that question of gender then can also be a non-consensual performance, which is something that happens in terms of anti-blackness, where in lynchings, for example, black men were often castrated as part of their lynching in order to tear away the masculinity from the body. So that is a way that gender performance can be forced upon individuals as well. So it's not always a choice. Sometimes you are forced to perform or you're